Spring break is finally here, which means nothing if you live anywhere like me where we rarely see the sun. That said, spring is typically a season of gradual reinvigoration as days get warmer, nights get brighter, and we're one cycle closer to doomsday. And what better way to hype ourselves before I crash us right back down next week with a transgressive splatter flick than with a saucy seasonal slasher that somewhat takes hold of its perversely hyper-sexualized reputation. I imagine some of you are at least vaguely familiar with Broken Lizard, a comedy troupe whose entire reputation rests on one modestly successful 2001 cult comedy called Super Troopers. They are very much the definition of fraternity sketch comedians who were never told they weren't all that talented, with much of their humor ranging from crass frat boy bro dude BS made for their generation to generic gross out cringy stoner characters who sometimes show a hint of self-awareness. While I would not call them an outright failure, I mean they somehow managed to crowdfund a 15-year belated sequel to Super Troopers, they really struggled to get their foot through the door of sex, stoner, and bro dude road trip movies popularized by American Pie and Todd Phillip movies. Fitting to their fraternity roots, they were basically the new kids on the block desperate to get into the cool kids party, despite predating the trend with a 1996 college comedy influenced by the films of National Lampoon, which itself practically pioneered that entire questionable genre of films. It wasn't until 2001 did they get their first real shot at mainstream success, only to immediately lose momentum when their sophomore follow-up Club Dread bombed at the box office, while their third effort Beer Fest barely broke even. There was another attempt in 2009 called Slammin' Salmon, but I've never heard of it. Yet the best way to describe Broken Lizard's modest cult reputation is that they were both 5 years too early and 5 years too late to the party. While they did fit the mold of the late 90s, early 2000s MTV Comedy Central bubble, nobody was screaming for more Broken Lizard because they lacked a USP worth capitalizing on. Their unofficial leader, Jay Chandrasekhar, was the only member to really take advantage of what connections they forged, as he built an admirable career as a director outside Broken Lizard films on projects like the Dukes of Hazzard film Undeclared, Arrested Development, and Community. They have toured as individual stand-ups, but depending on your taste, I think their stand-up sucks, while I'll admit Super Troopers and Beer Fest were mild, passable guilty pleasures that simply lack the quality performers of other films within the genre. However, their biggest failure, Club Dread, remains an interesting anomaly because while Super Troopers and Beer Fest faded into the mold of those types of generic comedies, Club Dread at least tried to spin the genre in a different direction, but as a whole, send me your thoughts and prayers. Club Dread tells the story of a Costa Rican resort called Pleasure Island, which is owned and operated by a soon-to-retire career-dead folk musician called Coconut Pete. After new guests arrive, along with a newly appointed masseur called Lars, we quickly learn of long-standing tensions between the resort staff, who are soon targeted by an elusive killer who leaves behind a threatening message that none of them will die as long as they keep quiet and do their jobs, only for the killer to ignore their own rule by continuing to murder them anyway. Don't worry too much about the killer's logic, because the movie does eventually point out how senseless the motive is when everything's explained, but we'll come back to that later. In theory, it's supposed to be a parody of slasher flicks as it plays off the concept and visual style of Friday the 13th, where a mysterious killer based on an urban legend punishes naughty camp counselors for not taking their job seriously, while having a setting that's identical to I Still Know What You Did Last Summer. But what it lacks in parody, it mostly lacks in everything else. I call it the American Pie of slasher movies purely in premise, because again, in theory, it's also supposed to pander to the raunchy sex comedy crowd, yet it's remarkably tame in that department, to the point I wonder if it's all a smokescreen to get thirsty folk through the door, only to blue balls them 5 minutes later with what can be more accurately described as a campy workplace comedy that just so happens to have a killer and a couple of stray tits along the way.
Something just brushed against my leg. No, there's seriously something down here. Oh, no, wait! It's just my gigantic cock.
There are times where it almost crosses the same debate as Tom Green's Freddy Got Fingered, in that it's ultimately lowbrow, oddball, and unclear in its intentions that, when you start to overthink about the way the humor and characters are delivered, you question if it's secretly kinda clever or just inadvertently so.
There's always one fuckhead like you, trying to shit in the apple pie. You just shat in the one apple pie that knows how to shit back.
I'm sorry, what the fuck? The movie is filled with these weird, witless, jarring lines that made me laugh in sheer bewilderment because of the confidence and conviction in which they're delivered. At the end of the day, it is pure farce in how the resort is filled with vapid activities and random bit characters who build up the impression of hell on earth rather than a comfortable paradise. There's still some cheeky spice to it to fit it firmly within the era of sex stoner comedies, but while that era seemed to celebrate its characters' inappropriate conduct, Club Dread mixes in some surprisingly pleasant characterization in between its sheer mockery of those inappropriate perversions and douchey stereotypes. By the way, there's no ignoring how these movies were a product of their time, as they say, but I don't feel a need to patronize your intelligence by pointing out everything morally and culturally wrong with them. I respect that you can use your own judgment for the type of media you consume, but for those that are interested in the tricky and complex relationship that this kind of media has with people, I have left a link to Pop Culture Detective's thoroughly researched topics in the description box below. I actually think it has a little in common with Dude, Where's My Car and Wet Hot American Summer, in that there's this uncanny meta weirdness to it where it plays entirely to its own logic, but lacks the full embrace of its quirkiness, in comparison to Wet Hot American Summer's B-movie charm, and Dude, Where's My Car's sci-fi psychedelic odyssey as if it were an adult version of Bill and Ted. Literally within the first 5 minutes, the movie beats in the sex stoner comedy crowds with drugs, nudity, voyeurism, offensiveness, crassness, a cheap monkey jump scare, and nip sucking. So far, so awful early 2000s comedy. However, there's a very distinct campiness to the delivery that overtly calls attention to the gratuitous cliches of your average American slasher flick.
Let's at least go inside that old mausoleum.
It doesn't do anything with it to call it a good homage or satire, but it does set up the conflict of employees being murdered by a mysterious assailant who then seems to lose their mask shortly after because they never wear it again, deferring to the shadowy fisherman look from I Know What You Did Last Summer. It actually has a nice little structural setup by flashing back to an hour earlier, where it introduces our main characters whilst establishing several of them as suspects after they get into petty altercations with our prior victims. The characters range from the insufferable shallow stereotypes I mentioned earlier to surprisingly sincere and sympathetic, especially from Bill Paxton, who serves as the film's marketing star power. Paxton clearly has a lot of fun with the role by developing a really interesting complex to his character Coconut Pete, as an overly sensitive, disillusioned, past his prime sex, drugs, and rock and roll musician who seems to have created the island as a way to retain his youthful pride, but carries constant resentment for how burnt he was by the music industry.
Play Margaritaville!
Think you mean Pina Colada Burke? Little song I wrote 7.5 fucking years before Margaritaville was even on the map.
They actually produced original songs for his characters signed by Bill Paxton that eventually become a plot point when they discover the killings are all linked to lyrics within an old Coconut Pete album, which kind of reveals him to be a bit of a hack who was never all that talented to begin with. He's such an unhinged character that you can't help but feel sorry for him because at times he does show an earnest care to make the island this wild, unforgettable experience, but lapses back and forth between his insecurities and nonchalance.
Yes, goddammit! Yes! Yes!
The two main protagonists that stand out as genuinely likable are Jenny the aerobics instructor and Lars the Buddhist masseur, who has this unique massage technique that seems to make people cream themselves, and that will come into effect later on. Their flirtatious relationship is a nice detox from the abrasive narcissists we're constantly surrounded by, as they both legitimately care about their jobs and bringing peace and joy to guests who just want to escape their stresses and strains. As deeply inappropriate crooked as his character is conceived, the resident dive instructor Juan is also immensely likable, as he's portrayed as a playful, sex-positive entertainer who eventually finds the right girl to settle down with called Penelope, which adds a bit of vulnerability to his character like Coconut Pete, where he's putting on an elaborate act for the sake of the guests' enjoyment. As for the rest of the Broken Lizard cast, well, you have Coconut Pete's nephew DJ Dave, who's just a straight-up entitled dickhead, Sam, aka the Fun Police, who's largely harmless but gave me war flashbacks to Jack Frost 2 for those who saw the video, and then we have Putman, a pathetically creepy tennis instructor who they decided to make British for some reason.
To be honest, that stretch of the jungle gives me an extraordinary case of the wonky britches.
Now, before we get into the slangs, it's worth addressing how the film goes about setting up the mystery of the island itself, and the very conflicting reason behind the killer's motive. As said earlier, the killer is believed to be solely targeting staff who are not doing their jobs, which in turn calls attention to the identity crisis Pleasure Island suffers from. The staff are essentially told to put on a performance and pander to the guests, while juggling the imbalance between guests who are shameless party animals and too vain to surrender their egos to the pure silliness that fun should be in the eyes of Sam the Fun Police, and those who simply want the peaceful, sentimental value that pleasure should bring. In other words, Coconut Pete's vision for the island is a mess of his own making. At times, it's a sincere attempt to embrace the spirit of pleasure in the short life we're given, while on the other hand, it's sort of built to preserve his fleeting legacy as he struggles with his irrelevancy and withering demeanor. As such, it suggests that the killer's overall motive is to purify the island, to restore it to the ethos and values it's supposed to uphold. Now, before you go, Ryan, it's a dumb sex stoner comedy, it's not that deep, while yes, you're totally right, this does actually explain the motive better than the movie does, but keep this in mind because it will make sense in the spoiler section. Now, there is a contradiction established in the opening that makes an explicit point about the island having a sacred heritage to it, where the douchey staff guy offensively mocks an old graveyard only to be killed by someone wearing a mask that I think is meant to represent the island's indigenous origins. At first, it seemed to be going for this theme of potential retribution for a culturally sacred land being bulldozed over for a vapid, classless party resort ignorant of the land they're desecrating. However, it seems to deliberately show that the resort never makes any mention of the island's history. It's a total whitewash that's only brought up again when Dave mentions the island's superstitious history of zombies and voodoo, only to flip it into a trashy story about a former employee called Phil Coletti, who went to a graveyard with a mysterious woman late one night, and during intercourse discovered the woman was actually a corpse, while the rest of the resort staff watched in the distance. Phil Coletti then proceeded to murder the staff, castrate himself, and disappeared into the jungle never to be seen again. Thus, legend has it that the island is not haunted by the indigenous origins for the desecration of their land, but instead is literally haunted by a dickless killer called Machete Phil.
And that boy was me!
You're an asshole, Putman.
I mean, in some perspective, you could make the argument that it's a blue humor jab that is targeting its own trashy farce. It could have been leading us in the direction of an actual statement about cultural ignorance and misappropriation for the sake of monetizing tourism, but ultimately, it's met with said ignorance. So from here on out, let's get into the actual killer and their motive. Spoilers going forward, brace yourself. When the killings begin, the staff are quick to start pointing fingers, even calling upon Coconut Pete's ex-FBI security guard to hunt down the killer, only for him to immediately die that same evening. After which, much of the suspicion is placed on Lars, as the murders only began to happen when he arrived on the island, as well as discovering his obsessive shrine devoted to Coconut Pete, as he claims to be his biggest fan, resulting in him being locked up before eventually escaping. Juan's lover Penelope is also briefly suspected to be the killer, given her irregular appearances after someone is murdered, leading to Juan, in his words, to pound her for information while the group stand by to save him.
You asshole. Now you're just trying to get laid. How would you like to be stuffed in this closet while I go out there and have sex?
That is a great idea.
By the way, during this, we also get a scene of Lars using his Buddhist powers to shrink his weight to hide under a bed while the killer attacks. It's so dumb, but I wish the movie had more of this kind of silliness to pad it out better. After a lot of back and forth, they eventually move their suspicions onto Pete because of his growing aggravation and resentment towards the island and staff, making you think that he's trying to regain control of what the island used to be, only for him to be unceremoniously killed off screen because they ran out of money to keep Bill Paxton around. After this, Putman has his finger pointed at Dave as he's set to inherit the island from Coconut Pete after his family was trampled to death years prior at one of Pete's concerts, and the response from everyone else is awkward.
Everyone knows Dave's parents got killed at a Pete show.
Way to bring up an sore subject. What?
Of course, as repetition would have it, Dave is then brutally murdered shortly after, so sights get set to Putman, because besides generally being a perverted asshole who's obsessed with Jenny, he hates the fact that Dave and the others belittle him constantly, explaining the specific reason for targeting the staff.
Namaste.
Fuck off.
However, as you would expect, they end up being wrong about this as well when he gets killed after being accidentally cuffed to his deathbed as he swings tennis balls at the killer, leading to one of the most prolonged, overly dramatic deaths in the film, as he discovers who the killer is and does anything but say their name, while Jenny and Lars hide in the other room.
I should have known it was you. Doesn't surprise me a bit, really.
Damn it, Batman. Who is it?
It all culminates in Lars, Jenny, Juan, and Penelope regrouping as the guests discover the corpses of the staff, leading to Sam being seemingly killed off screen, to which, no shit, he was the fucking killer.
Nobody ever suspects the fun police.
Bullshit. I always have suspected you.
Bullshit, you did not.
You are the bullshit!
It's kind of made obvious that he's going to be the killer by the fact that the movie never calls attention to Sam in an effort to make you basically forget he exists.
It's not a party until someone breaks the jacuzzi.
His motive is revealed to be nothing more than a lackluster petty envy plot to destroy the island, because Pete decided to sign the island's ownership over to his nephew Dave instead of Sam, who seems to think he was entitled to it for being the best employee, which isn't how inheritance works.
What happened to the hot tub?
As such, he's not doing it in some insane attempt to restore order and purity for an island he believes he could have made more prosperous and sentimental. He's just angry he wasn't given the island, and the group's reaction was exactly the same as mine. He's convinced Dave would ruin the business, and so he decides to ruin it himself, which makes no fucking sense other than chalking it up to Sam just being an absolute psychopath.
It wasn't about the grass. Although that was incredibly uncool.
He even tries to brush off the rumor he's Dickless Machete Phil by calling himself Machete Sam, but we can assume they're both the same person, seeing as it's practically confirmed by Putman when he hits Sam in the crotch with a tennis ball earlier in the film. Why the f am I explaining this? Lars then uses his orgasm massage powers to subdue him, I told you that would come back, and instead of incapacitating him completely, they escape into the jungle, eventually leading to Juan being fatally wounded as they prep a boat to escape. The actual climax is pretty decent in my opinion, as it decides to bookend itself with another nod to the original Friday the 13th by introducing a supernatural component that plays off the superstitious story told by Dave earlier in the film, where Sam seems disturbingly indestructible. Like, they brutally cut him in half and he still manages to emerge from the water like Jason Voorhees, with the last shot of the film seeing his disembodied legs swimming towards the boat. And that is Club Dread. It doesn't try to be anything more than what it is, and it sure as hell doesn't take much to make an impression as to the kind of film it will be for you. So until next time, stay safe, stay away from Pleasure Island, and I'll see you all very soon. Bye.